So here are some of the challenges that we currently face in terms of assessment. First one is we don't have any gold standard measures for everyday functioning. Because of that, using these different measures, we know across studies, even if you apply these different measures, you can get different information about how well you think a person is doing in their everyday life. The sensitivity of the measures too. So many of the questions might ask one overarching question. So I might ask, are you having any difficulty with cooking? And maybe I would say no, and maybe I'm in the early stages of MCI, and the reason I'm not having any difficulties with cooking is because I'm cooking one meal and I'm using my microwave. And I can do that, okay? So to me, I'm not having any difficulties with cooking. But if I ask, can you prepare a meal for 8? That would elicit a different response, right? So how we're asking these questions is important. The other thing is that our tests are often heavily weighted towards one cognitive dimension. So maybe they're pulling a lot on memory. And we talk about our medication management assessment that we've been using, and we think it involves a lot of like working memory capability. The other thing is that it's only testing one aspect of everyday functioning, medication management. And we don't know if the person's ability to cook or to manage their finances might also be affected. So ecological validity of our test is a real big concern. Things that we give in the laboratory, how well are they actually predicting what people are doing in their everyday life? So one of the questions, or two questions that we've been looking at, this has been a big area of interest for our lab. I think it's an important area for the future of neuropsychology. And that is, how are we either going to develop tests that are going to be better predictors of real world functioning, or how are we going to make use of some of our newer technologies so that we can understand better how people are doing in their everyday life. And I'll show you one way that we've been trying to develop better measures, and then we can talk more about technology too, because we've been using that as another means. So this is our day out task that first started in the SMART department, where people had to do a lot of different activities to prepare for a day out. One of the things that we really liked about this task is that it's more open-ended, it's ill-structured, so that an individual is not told you have to do these things in this order. And in fact, they're given things that if they don't think through them and decide that, I'm gonna put the heating pad in the oven well before I leave, they're gonna be stuck just sitting there waiting for the heating pad. Or if they don't figure out how much money it's going to cost to take the bus, going to get the money ahead of time is just going to be futile. So there's certain organization things that are going to make doing the task better and more efficient. And we found very nice age-related differences as well as effects of cognitive impairment on the day out task. So what we decided to do is see if we could bring that sort of task into the clinic. And we call this the night out task. And so individuals are tasked with doing a number of different activities to get ready for a night out. And as part of one of the summer gerontechnology programs, we actually had an app that was written so that we could code a lot of different data. And if you're coming to lab meeting today, Rayanne is actually going to report some work on the night out task and some of the really interesting variables that we've been able to capture with having the availability of coding things at a greater speed than the way we could code them just by using paper and pencil. And so again, allowing us to use technology to get at richer aspects of data. But also hopefully pulling into the lab maybe a sort of task that it's going to be a better reflection of the everyday environment, because people don't just have one sort of answer here or one way of doing this, and they have to think and multitask and be flexible when they're doing this sort of task. Okay, the other thing that we've talked about that we've been doing is monitoring people with either the wearables that some of you guys are working with, or the technologies in the environment, the sensors that you saw, or now we're also, one of the groups is working on item sensors that we could actually put on specific items to get more precise information about what people might be doing, what sort of compensatory strategies they might be using, or maybe even ways to understand their routine just by putting things on specific items that represent things that they use on a very consistent basis. But what I'd like to do is spend the last 15 minutes here talking a little bit about the Saturano article that you read for class. So really, it was geared toward that idea of using technologies to enhance aging in place. So what did you guys, or what were some of the takeaways or the challenges or, the things that you think need to be done in terms of moving technology to supporting aging in place? Okay, so cost is something that, and that's something that I've also thought about quite a bit. We're developing these technologies and we don't want to develop them in such a way that we're going to have, kind of this uneven where people who have the wealth are able to have access to these technologies and other people aren't, that could really benefit for them. So how are we going to do this in a cost-effective way? We've had a big education in that ourselves, and that for the past 20 years we've been bringing people into our lab to do our studies. And we just 2 years ago started this new study where we actually go out to people. And we're seeing a very different client population with lots more chronic health diseases than those who are actually able to come into our laboratory. And so that's probably similar for people who can easily come into the doctors on a regular basis versus people who can't. Yeah, very good point. I think that's a really good point. It's one, that we kind of struggle with. Like, I think there's a couple things here we struggle with in terms of, like, if we're going to do these intervention studies. One, it doesn't make sense that we do intervention studies on every different technology, for example, that would help you get out of a car, right? Like that would be very difficult and very costly. But a lot of times when we do these sorts of interventions, we want to find out, like, what is that part of the intervention that's actually leading to the change? So if we put too many things in, then it becomes, kind of muddy. But we're also seeing, like, even with prevention, the importance of putting a lot of things in because they may work synergistically with each other. And so that's kind of like the same idea here, right? Like, well, maybe one technology in and of itself isn't going to help you be independent, but if you are using a couple of different technologies synergistically, that might have a much bigger effect on your ability to remain independent. That's a really good point. This sort of research is not easy to get funded. We don't have a lot of funded studies out there that look at use of these sorts of technologies. And then if you can't show, like you said, the data behind it, then it makes it even more difficult to, get more funding or to get insurance to pay for these sorts of things. And Alyssa and I actually just finished writing a chapter on techniques to help with functional difficulties for people with neurological impairment. And we talked a part in there about the assistive technologies, but there's a couple of studies out there that you can refer to say that there's this evidence base that they help, but there's not a large body of research out there. And I think it's a problem, but I think that there's, and that has a lot of significant ramifications, and what can we do? How can we solve that? What's going to be the best way to do that? So that linking of these different technologies together, which also becomes a big question in terms of developing technologies that may not use the same platform, right? So so what do some of the computer scientists think of that, or engineers? How are we going to solve that problem? So, and we did see that brought up in the article. We're dealing with a population that is less technology savvy than the populations that are coming next. And how are we going to increase that comfort? And in fact, the first part of our digital memory notebook training is helping people develop that self-efficacy that they actually can use and engage with the technology. And that's part of the design process too, right? Because if we have something that, pulls on things that are, changes in cognition or mobility or sensory changes that are going to make it difficult to use the technology, they're just going to stop using it before they even start, right? So, then that behooves us to think about what we can put in place to do that. And again, going back to the digital memory notebook training, one of the first things that we train them on is a common place to put your memory notebook. And we're actually right now experimenting with a tracker that you can put on your memory notebook. But those are things that you can't just take for granted, right? But if we want people to use them, we have to be proactive and think about these issues and what is going to be the best way to help people overcome these issues. So very good points. Yeah, I think it's starting to change, and it's still, it's so funny now because I've been at a couple of conferences where people will come up to me and say, I started working with like engineers or computer scientists, and before that would not be something. And, people are getting so excited about that now because they're seeing that overlap and how you can, push the boundaries and actually be able to develop things that are going to have a real impact, because we can bring that knowledge base from what we know clinically and then have that support of how things can be developed in the best way. And I think that's changing in industry too. I think industry is looking to have people that have that clinical knowledge on base. And there's a lot more of designing with the individual, right? So I think, probably 10 years ago when Diane and I first started working together, I think it was pretty much the norm in engineering that you just kind of did your thing and then here it is. But I think that's really changed over the last, here. Yeah, so how can we find that balance, right? Or we can upgrade things and make them new, but still have enough of that old there. And we do know that it's actually good for older adults to be, using these technologies and trying, because, it keeps them mentally active, and that's really important too. So at least some of the fear about technologies, but technologies are going to keep changing, right? So there still will probably be some of those issues, but I think that you're right. We're going to have less issue with the idea of using technology itself, because people are going to be very comfortable with it. Or say, putting a smart home in when people are so used to, everything being able to track what you're doing. That's probably going to be less of an issue. Whereas I get a lot of that, like this is like, Big Father watching, there's a lot of concern about, having some of that monitoring in people's homes. And I think the distraction part of the technologies is probably something we need to think about too. I think about like cars. There's a lot of good things that they're putting on cars now, right? Like the GPS, and if you go over the line, it will ring. But there's also a lot of things on that screen that, if you're trying to fool with something, that could potentially cause some problems too, right? So I think we have to be like taking all of that into consideration when especially in technologies like that, not to have distractions that might actually get us in accidents. I think we did propose like that end output would be trying to get that information into medical records, but that's an interesting idea, like trying to do a backdoor in, like weaving what you're doing with what's being funded. Okay. Yeah, and technology itself changes so fast, right? And in the clinical realm, you have to really validate everything that you're doing and know it's valid and reliable if you're going to say this is a healthcare indicator, right? That's a real big thing in our data. In fact, it can take years to norm our tests because you need to get representative populations. But does that really fit that well with the technology? I've been thinking about this a lot too, just like if we're going to get things out there, if we spend years trying to validate everything, but yet we don't want to put something out there that's not safe or okay, is the technology going to have changed and moved on by the time we reach that point? I think these are really interesting questions. Okay. Maybe one of the reasons for those SBIR grants that are trying to bring industry and academia together and more push for us as researchers also to push products out with industry. But then again, that's a whole new skill set, right? We were never trained on how to do this. And so how do we make those partnerships work better and more efficiently? So like our digital memory notebook as an example, like we could put it out and we could say, this will help with everyday functioning, but like I would never do that unless I actually had experimental data, right, to show that we can do that. And we know that it's not just you hand it to someone, you have to train them on how to use it, right? So that's like a whole process in and of itself. But yeah, very, very interesting points there, Kat.